conservative,
Christian, mother, wife,
Air Force veteran.
gun rights advocate.
This is Stacy on the Right. Here's your host, Stacy Washington.
Thank you for being with us this evening, bringing you all of the news and information. You're required listening. You're locked and loaded with SiriusXM's Patriot Channel. Stacy Washington here. I'm not just Stacy on the Right. I'm right, and I bring you nothing but the best news, the best information, the best guests, the best presentation, all wrapped in the dulcet tones of Stacy Washington. And I'm glad to be with you. I'm always happy to be on the microphone here. Exclusively heard on SiriusXM, and welcoming into the program, back to the show actually, one of our favorite guests, Victoria Churchill, U.S. political reporter for the Daily Mail, covering Capitol Hill. She's a Young Voices contributor. Victoria, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me, Stacy. Always great to be back with you.
I'm glad you're here. We have a lot to dive into tonight, and especially with you writing about this over at the Daily Mail. This is very interesting. MTG has decided to resign from Congress, and people are taking note of the timing, that she's waiting until the 5th of January instead of retiring in November or just after Thanksgiving. And she says she gave quite a lengthy kind of explanation. And now, there's a lot of talk going on about what's next for her. And so what's your analysis on her leaving Congress?
Well, I think this is something that we could see coming. Of course, there has been rifts, particularly between MTG and President Trump over the last few months, particularly over the issue of the Epstein files. You know, I was there at the press conference on Capitol Hill last week that MTG, Thomas Massie, and Ro Khanna did with the Epstein survivors, and kind of after the wrap-up of their testimonies, MTG was actually she seemed quite hurt, honestly, by some of the remarks that President Trump had thrown her way, particularly calling her a traitor. You know, she's somebody that considered herself a day one supporter of the MAGA movement and of the president, dating all the way back to 2015, long before she ran for Congress. And so, you know, that statement that she put out last week, it was quite lengthy. It was about 4 pages, basically breaking down everything that she saw as the issues with Washington, with the Republican Party. And so, you know, it's not surprising to really see her take this move and announce her resignation.
Okay, so you being in the room, because, you know, MTG is not known for being a wallflower or someone who is easily hurt. You said you saw that she appeared to be visibly shaken by the comments made by President Trump. And this is the press conference, so they were there together, or you're talking about the comments that he'd made previously?
This is the Epstein survivors, or the Epstein victims press conference. This was before they had the vote in the House last week, and then of course, obviously, that passed with the support of every single member of Congress that was there except for one. And then it went to went over to the Senate, where it was passed by unanimous consent. And President Trump, of course, signed that bill to release the files that had been brought through with this, this procedural move of the discharge petition, which I'm sure you and I have even talked about in the last few months, really, as this has been going on. But you know, again, the thing that I think is interesting is that the release of the Epstein files is, of course, something that Trump really promised to do last year on the campaign trail in 2024. And so, you know, I think to MTG, she was seeing herself as staying true to the man that she believed in President Trump, and who she campaigned for numerous times all over multiple states. And so, you know, of course, this resignation is making the waves right now, but it's also interesting to note that MTG is far from the only member of Congress that's frustrated with Washington, with the way that things have gone. Of course, we've seen over the past few months, some members of Congress have said that they will not be seeking re-election next year in the midterms. They're choosing to run for state offices. That's everybody from the likes of Elise Stefanik running for governor in New York to, you know, kind of the opposite side of the political spectrum, the Freedom Caucus guys like Chip Roy, who's running for Attorney General back in his home state of Texas. You've got Ralph Norman, of course, running against another member of Congress from South Carolina, Nancy Mace. They're both in the gubernatorial primary there. You've got Byron Donalds in Florida. And so, I think a lot of people are framing it as they see that the best way to support the Trump agenda is to serve back in their home states. But, I think the frustrations that are being felt by members with, the gridlock, of course, we just got done with the longest shutdown in history. I think regardless of party, it's very hard to run when you have been a part of that. And so, I think we'll probably see more moves, more potential either resignations or members announcing that they won't be running for re-election in the next few weeks. Of course, as we get to these final weeks of the year, members finally get to spend some time at home with their families. And, I'm sure you've seen all of these announcements in the past, right? But, they always say, I've spent time with my kids and my grandkids, and it's time for me to get out of here. Referring to Washington, I think, is how a lot of these statements go.
Yeah, and I have the same reaction now that I usually have when it happens then, and that is it feels like cowardice to me that when the going gets rough, you have a long shutdown, instead of taking a victory lap when you get back, instead of saying we survived the shutdown and we have more work to do on behalf of the American people, you just make sure you hit your pension target and then you go off into your private life. And I know that, that obviously I can't understand every pressure that a congressperson is under. And certainly I wouldn't want to go toe to toe with President Trump. So this is not me, discounting anything that Marjorie Taylor Greene has been up to. And I've respected her work. So I don't have a personal thing against her. It's not like I'm personally saying, oh, she's not a good congressperson. But the timing to me appears to be set up so that it's the most disadvantageous to the agenda that she says she supported. And that's me saying I understand that she has her own familial obligations, but what about the voters? What about the agenda? What about getting it done for the American people? Where does all of that go?
Well, I think it's interesting. You look at, I think, the other prominent resignation that's making waves this week because of kind of the impact of it. The other Greene, of course, we had Congressman Mark Greene of Tennessee. His special election to fill his seat is happening tomorrow, and that's a deep red district that Republicans, I assume, hopefully still think that they're still going to keep. But that's one that has drawn lots of dollars from the Democrats as an attempt to kind of flip a seat that again Republicans have seen as safe. And so, even though Marjorie Taylor Greene is leaving from a very strong Republican district, pretty much a R+20 district, I'm sure Democrats will kind of pick on that dissatisfaction with President Trump and try to kind of weasel themselves into any kind of power. Again, I'm sure in that case their dollars will probably not end up resulting in a victory, but I'm sure that they're going to try and exploit that frustration, that position that Marjorie Taylor Greene has shared, particularly over her last few months. When she's gone on CNN, she's gone on The View, she's really tried to present herself as the key champion of the MAGA movement, the one that elected President Trump even more than the president himself. And so, I think those are definitely all interesting considerations. But what we're also seeing with all of these people that run in these districts, they run now or they run to fill the remainder of the seat, and then they're pretty much going to have to be running again. I mean, we're already coming up on filing deadlines for the midterms in some states, and then, pretty much as soon as the new year kicks off, we'll have more filing deadlines, more primaries starting in the first couple months of the year. And so, it's really this constant boon of this election. It's going to be ever constant. It's going to be ever present. Democrats are going to try to be capitalizing on that. They're going to, bring in any kind of energy that they can from the results that we saw earlier this month with Virginia, of course, my home state, with New Jersey, of course, with Mamdani in New York. And so, it's definitely going to be a really interesting fight really all across the country. And so I think it's going to be interesting for Democrats if they actually do choose to play in these super deep Republican districts. The Democrat donor class is definitely large and definitely deep-pocketed, but it's also going to be interesting to see if these donors are going to be seeing it as worthwhile to invest in these districts just for the purpose of picking a bone with the president.
Well, yeah. I mean, the donors are, the money is not as plenteous as it was because a lot of the network that the Democrats had through USAID, where money was kind of coming out of government coffers and going into their to Act Blue, that funnel has been dismantled, largely dismantled by the work of Doge. So now you have them kind of trying to figure out how to reconstitute, how to regroup. And there's also the issue of momentum, where they had the shutdown for a while. So they were able to kind of capitalize on shutdown woes and, talking about the shutdown. But now that the shutdown's over, it's really about whether or not they have a message. And I haven't seen the Democrats share a message that is palatable to voters. Yes, they hate Trump. Yeah, but what are they going to do to help Americans? And how can they help Americans if the agenda is the same one that Biden governed on and Kamala Harris ran on, which was a failed agenda? So they have a messaging issue. Meanwhile, Republicans have to deliver because they're in control. They have they have the levers of power, and they want to keep them and even expand what they're able to do. So, it's an interesting time, but it's politics. It doesn't change much. It just, the party in power, obviously different, but not a lot changes. Like there's not a major shift away, even though we're talking about President Trump. He has 3 years left, essentially, close to, just a hair over.
He does. And, I think the messaging itself is really interesting, particularly when you look back over the last few weeks with the shutdown. This budget that was passed, it is not a conservative budget. It is, in many ways, a continuation of the Biden spending plan. And so it was Biden-level spending that Democrats opposed for over a month and a half, which, again, just to your point about messaging, they were basically messaging against their own past priorities. Of course, we're going to be seeing this fight over health care that is probably going to shape up over the next few weeks. Of course, I've heard some rumors that the White House is going to try and kind of implement their own plan to potentially not have a fight on Capitol Hill. So that'll be another interesting thing to watch over the next couple of days to see if they actually do end up presenting something or if that ends up kind of going by the wayside in the rumor mill. But, again, you're completely right. The Democrat messaging in the midterms will have to be, again, focused on President Trump. But Democrats are not going to be able to say what they stand for, much like I think we saw, again, even in Virginia, all up and down the ballot. And again, I know this because I live here, right? We had candidates running for House of Delegates that were being framed as, Trump stooges, when I'm sure a lot of these people have never even met the president. People that are running in these districts in Northern Virginia in particular. I mean, after the results of earlier this month, we have 0 Republicans representing a single seat in Northern Virginia, probably up to like almost 3 hours outside of D.C. And, again, that just goes to show that the Democrats have been pointing any kind of messaging that they can on Trump, on, what they saw as pain inflicted by what, of course, you mentioned, the Doge cuts, the cuts for a lot of federal positions. They were able to pin that all on him. But, I think even Republicans, again, going back to our earlier chat about MTG, right? A lot of Republicans are realizing Trump is not going to have the power, definitely not after the midterms. I mean, the political pendulum swings every time there's a president. The midterm election, his party loses seats. And, again, Republicans are already working with razor-thin margins. If there's any more resignations, there's even chatter that, if another representative or two follows in MTG's steps, Mike Johnson's speaker gavel may potentially come into contention if Republicans aren't able to hold on to any of those seats where those resignations happen. So, the Trump agenda, they've been pushing it through Congress, the House and the Senate as much as they can. But if there's any kind of barriers to that, those might actually come sooner than a lot of people are expecting, sooner than 2027. It may even happen at some point next year.
Yeah, I'm not really buying that. I don't think the epic victory that President Trump was able to pull off in the election last year is going to fizzle out in a, basically everybody in Congress just resigns just to, basically to spite him. I think there are a lot of people who are going to think about their legacy. They're going to think about the epic win that President Trump had, and they're going to want to leave on a high note. MTG is in a unique situation. this is a temper tantrum for her because she wants to run for U.S. Senate in Georgia, and apparently the polls don't support her running. And so when the White House said they wouldn't endorse her, then you have her going on The View, and, it was just like this unbelievable, it was a backlash that she executed on. And I understand wanting something. I don't understand destroying everything that you've worked so hard for when people are saying, we don't think you'll be able to win. And that was the conversation. That was the conversation that the White House had with MTG. We don't think the polls show that you can win the U.S. Senate seat. And instead of kind of saying, okay, I got to win them over, I got to change the poll numbers, I got to make some changes, instead it becomes a big, battle of wills, and now she's resigning. I don't see a lot of people wanting to go out on the same vein as Marjorie Taylor Greene is going out on. Basically, they would be saying, I also want to have a temper tantrum and go on The View and resign because none of these other congressional members have higher aspirations that the Trump administration has put cold water on. So her situation is pretty unique. I don't see her as being a leader in congressional resignations this term, but I mean, anything's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we do see those resignations, it may actually come from the opposite wing of the Republican Party. So, for example, any Republicans that are in districts that Trump lost, there's still a handful of them, particularly somebody that comes to top of mind is Don Bacon in Nebraska, for example. He's already said that he's not running again for the next term. And so, he's one that may potentially be a seat to watch. Of course, Nebraska is always watched because they split their electoral votes in the presidential years. And, that's a district that Bacon has held on to. I went to college in Kansas, and so I knew quite a few conservative activists that were up in Nebraska because I was about a few hours away from where I went to school. And, they were really proud of the work that they did in that seat, kind of being able to message on their local issues and not really getting caught up in a lot of the national rhetoric. But it seems like even figures like Bacon have really been unable to, both serve their constituents as well as serve the president's agenda, which I think is really a tussle that a lot of members are dealing with that are in those districts that are a lot tougher. I'm sure if they're saying that they might not run again, they may even see no point in serving out the rest of their terms.
So are there any Democrats who are planning on resigning or have indicated that they're having a, change of heart, or maybe they're older and they're resigning? I think it's interesting that all of the discussion right now is around the possible resignations of the members of Congress who are Republicans, but we don't hear anything about any Democrats. And there was a rash of Republicans who resigned from Congress before President Trump was elected. So, that's why the margin is razor thin. So I'm trying to figure out, where are the Democrats who are resigning?
There's definitely nobody that is coming to top of mind, but there are also some tensions brewing within the Democrat Party. For example, actually last week during the debate over the Epstein files, there was Congresswoman Marie Gluskamp-Perez of Washington State. She was able to go on the House floor and actually criticize actions taken by one of her colleagues, one of the members of her own caucus, Congressman Chuy Garcia from Illinois. I don't know if you followed any of those developments on your show, but he's a congressman who actually was the first signature on a ballot petition for his chief of staff to succeed him in his seat in Congress. There's, of course, the investigation into another member who allegedly funneled some FEMA dollars into her own pocket during the COVID crisis. So, the Democrat Party is definitely full of problems. Another thing that I think is interesting is that Speaker or Minority Leader, potentially probably the next Democrat Speaker, Hakeem Jeffries, he doesn't seem as willing to weed those individuals out of his own party. Of course, he wants to have all of the processes that are supposed to play out, whether that's investigations, ethics investigations within Congress, whether that's, criminal prosecutions by other government bodies. He wants to let all those things play out. Of course, we live in a country where you are innocent until proven guilty, so I understand why that's the position that he's taking. But I still think that there are definitely a lot of questions in the minds of voters about the integrity of some Democrats. And again, I think it's interesting to note that some of these concerns are being raised by some of their own colleagues within their own caucuses.
It's true. There are some very interesting times ahead, and I think the things you're pointing out. Well, first of all, voters have to be willing to call their elected officials, talk to their You are a constituent. If you're a voter, if you're a citizen, you're a constituent. Call and talk to your members of Congress and find out what their concerns are. And begin to think about who you'd like to see run to replace some of these people, because if there are going to be resignations, that means new people have to run. It's always a pleasure to get your perspective, and especially on these really thorny issues and these resignations. It's such a volatile time in Washington, D.C., but when is it never not? I think that's the normal setting for D.C. Victoria Churchill, you can find her work at dailymail.co. It's dailymail.co. I have her story that she wrote linked here, and the show notes over at stacyontheright.com. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I'll definitely be keeping track of all this and would love to chat about it again soon.
Absolutely. We'll have you back, and happy Thanksgiving. Good to talk to you tonight.